Hey everyone, Panyo here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of After Dinner Mints. I highly encourage everyone watching to join us in the Art Blocks Discord. A link to our Discord can be found in the description of the video. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode of our weekly show. And now I want to introduce our guest for this afternoon. We have generative artist Sterling Crispin.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sterling, for being here today on After Dinner Mints. We have a lot to cover, a lot of really cool stuff that you don't have like on Art Blocks and off of Art Blocks. But yeah, let's go ahead and kick things off. If you can tell us just a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. Going way back, I've got my BFA in painting and drawing from the small art school in Colorado called the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. And afterward, I did like a 3-year artist in residence at a place called Redline that was like a big studio space. And around that time, I had read like all of Ray Kurzweil's books and was thinking about the singularity and technology, and decided I wanted to go back to grad school. So I enrolled at UC Santa Barbara and got an MFA in studio art. But at the same time, I was working on a Master of Science in this program called Media Arts and Technology. And they had some really amazing facilities there. There was like a mixed reality lab called the Trans Lab, and then this facility called the Allosphere that's like a 3-story tall metal sphere that's a fully surround sound, 3D projection with like 100 channel audio. So I was like making this insane kind of media art prototypes in these VR labs, and then left grad school and ended up doing a bunch of work at AR VR startups and exhibiting work and trying to balance working in the technology space and also making art in my free time.
Very cool. When you were getting into art and you kind of figured that maybe this is something that you wanted to explore, who were some of those early artists that kind of inspired your work early on?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate in high school. I was living in Pittsburgh, and they had this amazing space there called the Mattress Factory that was full of installation art. So at a young age, I got to see James Turrell pieces, and the Carnegie Art Museum there does a show called the Carnegie International. So I got exposed to Julie Maritu's work, these huge kind of abstract, almost architectural drawings. And then I'm really interested in conceptual art. So John Baldessari and Richard Long has this piece where he just walked back and forth in a field until it made a line, which is kind of this bizarre, amazing piece of artwork. But as far as like generative and digital art goes, I really got turned on to it. First because of Luc Dubois. He was doing a presentation at RimCAD, and for a brief moment, he kind of switched tabs and he showed this Max MSP patch, which is like this visual programming language with all these wires everywhere. And I was like, hold on a second, like, what the hell was that? Um, and I got to see some early work by Golan Levin and Zach Lieberman. They have this piece called the Manual Input Workstation that's like a projector. And then when you make shapes with your hands that block the projection, they like turn that shape into a solid object and it hits the ground. And it was like so playful. And I really feel like that's one of like the greatest digital artworks of all time. So that really like blew my mind and made me feel like I wanted to incorporate that and digital art into my art practice.
Great. And so you do have some work background in the AR VR industry, and I'm curious to know, obviously, kind of just your thoughts about VR and AR in general, but then also in the metaverse as well.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm currently employed in the AR space, so I don't want to like talk too much about immediate specifics, but I do think that it's the kind of thing that like, Facebook has such a poor public reputation. People have like a knee-jerk negative reaction to them making the metaverse, and there's this like strange negative perception of it right now. But I think eventually we're going to get to a point where, head mounted displays are light enough you can wear for 5 hours at a time, and the screens are going to be higher res than the human eye can see. And it's just going to reach this like incredible level where, regular people are going to be deciding like, should I buy the next like 5K resolution TV, or should I just buy this virtual thing that can put, you know, a home movie in my house and, have these like immersive, Netflix produced HBO quality, experiences. And it's going to be one of those things that like people ignore and ignore and ignore, and then suddenly it's just going to explode. So I really think that it's like the future of consuming media for sure.
Yeah. Do you find that kind of scary though, in a way, that for people to just have like headsets on, like, you know, for an extended amount of time? Like, I think a lot of people right now have them, just in their private houses, and obviously just do it for like an hour or so at a time. But when you're thinking kind of long term, how does that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, you know, um, like privacy issues. I think that's the main thing. I think eventually all the form factor stuff will be comfortable and you'll just not really even think about it. But like, there's all kinds of wild things where, with eye tracking technology, you can detect whether or not someone's got diabetes. And, the way that your eyes dart back and forth on a scene can really tell you a lot about, um, what you're interested in, and even like pick up on your sexual orientation. There's been research that shows that like as you're reading a piece of text, um, researchers can like interrupt you in the middle of like reading a moral statement at certain times and change your decision about that moral statement. So there's like, eye tracking is a very delicate technology, and I hope that we treat it carefully.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like technology is just going to be part of our you know culture. It is part of our culture, and moving forward, it's just going to be more and more ingrained in how we operate on a day-to-day basis. I'm
Totally.
curious to know, what was your introduction into the NFT and crypto space?
Yeah. So, um, I've been working with machine learning in my own art and following a lot of machine learning artists and programmers and researchers. And I saw Helena Sarin and Mario Kingleyman minting really early super rare works. And, at the time I was like trying to break into the blue chip art market and, building big, expensive, hard to store sculptures. And I was like, this is my career path, but it's so cool that like, these fringe machine learning artists have found a platform. So I was like following it along in the early days, but didn't really think that it was a viable career path. But obviously as things progressed, it was like obvious that there could be this healthy market around it. And actually, it's so much more attractive than the contemporary art world, because the contemporary art world is all about hiding information and controlling information and being able to like, tell collectors that the work is worth something that it's not, or that someone used to own it. And like with the blockchain, it's all just visible. And like if you want to buy something, you don't have to go through this crazy like gatekeeping process. You just click buy. So all that's like super exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. And like, how did you learn about art blocks? And what was it about the platform maybe that you decided to launch a project on it?
Yeah, I think that the first piece that I really saw might have been ringers or squiggles. I'm not really sure, but I think I followed like 4,000 people on Twitter, probably like too many. So I definitely see stuff pop up when it starts to blow up. And it's a really interesting format. It's kind of like its own type of artwork or its own medium, the format that Art Blocks has made. Because I feel like a lot of generative artists, you're changing code and it does something, you take a screenshot, and then you come back the next day and you change some stuff, and like it's never, you can kind of never get back to where it was last week unless you're obsessively committing every piece of code to GitHub or something like that. And it's this like evolving process. But with Art Blocks, you're trying to get to a system that everything that it produces looks good, and that you don't know what it's going to make until it makes it. And then once it makes it, it's final. It's like really a radically different way of approaching generative art, which is exciting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I do want to talk about your project Neophyte in a little bit, but can we talk about, or can we see some of those early generative art pieces that you created? Love to kind of just get you a peek into, the art that you created early on.
Yeah, sure. Going way back, I was doing like live visuals for concerts and stuff and was like programming the Microsoft Connect to be able to like respond in real time and like build these generative images like before grad school. And then getting into grad school, I was like really interested in artificial life and pattern formation. Like I think that, you know, every programmer or generative artist has like picked up a pine cone and looked at like the repeating patterns in nature and just been blown away about the complexity of the world. So I was thinking a lot about that and like agent-based simulations and always trying to figure out a way to turn them into physical objects. So some of these agent-based simulations, I was like leaving behind volumes of forms and then trying to construct them into solid objects and eventually 3D print them. This is another like agent-based simulation where I was like sculpting kind of the space around the agents based on their sort of like predator prey dynamics with each other. And it looked so much like a heart. I thought it was
Yeah.
interesting to like turn it into this like 3D printed sculpture where I started off with like um, I think a um, like a 3D biological scan of a heart, and then had
Hmm.
these agent-based simulations like tearing through the geometry and changing it. And then some early just sort of like pattern formation explorations and stuff like that. But it's probably better if you are tuning in and want to look at this stuff. It's just my website /generative.html. It's kind of probably tough to see the compression on some of this stuff,
Yeah.
but yeah, a lot of early sketches and trying to figure out how to take all these building blocks and really like coalesce them into physical objects. Back in the day, 10 years ago, that was kind of my focus.
Cool. And to kind of show the progression of your art on the blockchain, I'd love to see if you could share, your first ever NFT that you minted.
Yeah, sure. So the first NFTs that I minted, it was a series of seven conceptual artworks. I really liked the idea that with NFTs, you can almost like sell an idea itself. And really interested in like Yoko Ono's book Grapefruit as this collection of like really awesome conceptual artworks. So yeah, the first seven that I made were these kind of like you know uh, renderings of digital objects meant to look physical with these provocations on them. So property ownership is a consensual hallucination, kind of a twist on the cyberspace quote, thinking about just, how do you own an NFT? What does it really mean to own this ephemeral thing? Like all ownership is, like we can only own things because humans agree that that's a thing. It's an
Hmm.
idea. Like owning a building is just an idea, like owning an NFT. We all have this like consensual agreement amongst each other that that's a thing. And then some other ideas like if you imagine the location of every computer mining Bitcoin and the shortest distance between each computer connected together forms this kind of like, three-dimensional graph. And then there's another network of all of the, information lines that connect all these machines. And that's another graph. And the idea of this graph you're imagining right now is a sculpture, and the image isn't the artwork, and the description uh, is basically the artwork. And yeah, a lot of kind of like riffs on that. I also was kind of like poking fun at the Lambo culture of crypto, basically saying that this NFT is basically the act of someone buying me a Porsche, and it's like a stand-in for that kind of action where the act of buying the NFT funds this Porsche, and I've been like adjusting the list price of the NFT to match the price of the car like once a month. So it's kind of become this like insane endurance performance artwork in itself, just like keeping the listing alive.
That's cool. Would you actually buy, like, say somebody purchases, would you
Oh
actually
yeah,
buy the Porsche? Okay.
100%. Yeah, I wouldn't just like put in the S&P 500 and be like, oh, gotcha. I would definitely buy the car.
Where can people find these NFTs? Are they on OpenSea or
These are on
like?
Foundation, but
Okay,
yeah, I think you could probably also buy them on OpenSea. But yeah, check out my page on Foundation.
cool. Well, I'm excited for the day. Hopefully, when somebody picks up that NFT and see your brand new Porsche.
Yeah, totally. And interestingly, I found a huge graphite piece someone had done where they drew a life-size Cadillac and sold the piece for the price of the car and went and bought the car. So it's definitely, I didn't know that when I built this piece, but it's there's some history to the concept for sure.
Yeah. And I'm curious now also, with regard to these NFTs, was it hard to decide like which piece to mint first because you knew that this was kind of like your first piece ever on the blockchain, or was it something where like you already knew in the back of your mind and you kind of just went with it?
Well, I knew that I wanted to do some kind of conceptual statements about, NFTs in general and kind of like question the medium and how they exist and what they are. And I came up with, I don't know, 25 pieces and decided to mint seven of them.
Mm, cool. That's great. And I do want to talk about, before we get into Neophyte, I would love to talk about some of your early work. Um, First one being the Bitcoin mining sculpture they made in 2015, which I think is such a cool piece. Yeah, do you mind talking a little bit about that? And yeah, the kind of that, like basically what it, or yeah, kind of just go with it for now.
Sure. So at the time I was living in LA and there was, all these fires and news about like LA and California running out of groundwater and like we're farming with like 10,000-year-old groundwater and we don't know how much of it is left. And it's kind of like this insane end of the world feeling. But at the same time, people were talking about like drones delivering groceries and, autonomous cars and augmented reality and all these, futuristic things about AI becoming gods. And I was like, how can drones deliver our groceries if we don't have enough water to, to
Yeah.
go around? So I was thinking about these like extreme dualities of like collapse and growth, and also like artwork as a speculative investment, right? Like blue chip artwork, people buy it a lot of times and it sits in storage, and it's a speculative investments. And thinking about the future of technology growing is also a speculation, and thinking about you know global economic and environmental meltdown is also a speculation. So it's like kind of trying to take all these anxieties that I was feeling about the world and like put them into one object that would represent it. So it's called self-contained investment module and contingency package. So it's this sculpture made out of 80/20 aluminum, which is kind of this like engineering material with a Bitcoin mining sculpture inside of it, as well as like these survival objects. So this water bottle lets you drink like polluted river water and filter it out. There's like heirloom seeds and like hand crank radios and like dehydrated food bars and like this big survival knife in it. But at the same time, you can plug the sculpture in and mine Bitcoin with it. So you're kind of hedging your bets in every direction, right? Like maybe it'll accrue value as this contemporary art piece. Maybe it'll accrue value as this Bitcoin mining thing, which in 2015 felt like very speculative. And if none of those things work out and society collapses, maybe you can just like take the sculpture apart and use its like raw use value to, survive the apocalypse.
That's awesome. And is this piece still functioning today? And are you still, is it still being mined, or I don't know if you still
Yeah.
have it in possession or not?
No, I was in an exhibit in Paris and was sold. I definitely mined some Bitcoin with it, and it's gone. I don't know what happened to it. I
Yeah.
had like a password to the mining pool website that no longer exists. One of those things. So Bitcoin's gone. I think that the owner left it in storage and didn't mine Bitcoin with
Oh,
it.
really?
And at some point, they
Oh man.
contacted me when the price exploded, and they're like, I want to set this up, and yeah, things kind of never worked out. So it's in
Uh,
the art storage timeline.
that's such a cool piece. And so you have a couple other pieces that I'd love for you to talk about. Is it the Morphogenesis series, which is like, it looks like there's three of them, and then also
Yeah.
some vases.
Yeah, so the Morphogenesis series, I've been working with like plants and kind of like vase sculptures for a while in my artwork, and I was watching the emergence of like text to image GANs appearing as an artistic tool, but I didn't want to just like generate images via text with somebody else's code. Like I wanted to do something else with it. So I was making these hand painted animations of flowers growing, and then I edited a text to speech or a text to image neural network so that as the basis of that generation, it would start with every frame of animation. So every frame of hand painted animation is being like augmented towards a text to image representation. I think the prompt was, like Van Gogh, Rembrandt, still life, high quality art station, rendering Unreal Engine or something like that. Um, but yeah, I really love how it's kind of like this hybrid between a 3D rendering and a 2D animation and like a hand created thing and something like made generatively. It's like trying to sort of play around with those hybrids of like how those different technologies could kind of like combine together and using neural networks more as like a accelerant to human made mark making versus like letting it kind of like run on um, its own direction.
Cool. And so I'm actually curious to know about. It seems like a recurring theme with a lot of your projects has to do with plants. And where does that kind of come from? And yeah, can you talk to us about how you kind of integrate it into all these different projects?
Yeah, so like I was saying, in grad school, just really thinking a lot about like the computational sort of beauty of nature and how like generative the physical and natural world is, but it's just like infinitely complex. I took this pattern formation course at one point, and you start sort of like using the wave equation to simulate how waves propagate through material and how like smoke can be approximated. But all these algorithms, they're just approximations as like complicated as they can get. And also like that conflict I was talking earlier about, technology and in the environment and like the human made and the natural world. I just like embodying these kinds of like conflicting forces in the world. I think that's also part of it. And I see humans as a natural force in the world and technology also as this like emergent sort of other force, whether it's a force of nature or like technology as this big organism sort of in tension with the rest of the world.
Great, I appreciate you sharing that. So you also have this other project. It's from a solo show called Future Tense. It looks like it was an NFT bundled with a physical.
Yeah, so Future Tense was my first solo show in New York City, and it had a lot of parallels to that self-contained investment module of this like tension between, technology, creating artificial general intelligence and these like huge accelerating sort of trends in the world against the, collapse of society and the potentials for it. And all of this felt very speculative in January of 2020 before the pandemic. But obviously things changed a lot. And a lot of that sort of like fragility of society stuff became a little more literal. But yeah, I'd had this show and, was very fortunate to have a New York Times mention of it and really expected that my gallerist would take this to art fairs around the world and show it. But of course, like the pandemic happened, and I thought, uh, it was a perfect opportunity to mint the whole exhibit as NFTs. So all the work is available as a collection on OpenSea, and I've sold a few pieces to people and mailed them the physical work. So the NFTs are really like almost like receipts for the physical object, which a lot of people have sort of speculated on. Maybe that's how they could be used in the contemporary art world. And just really quickly, there was like a series of vases in the show that were all CNC'd out of aluminum and anodized, and they're Ikebana vases. So you're meant to kind of like revisit them and set up these floral arrangements over and over again, and then kind of like contemplate like the existential sort of relationship between like technology and humans and nature. Like Ikebana is a very contemplative practice. So I thought it'd be interesting to like replace the earthen earthen vessel with this, highly technological one.
Yeah, and I'm curious that actually, since these are NFTs bundled with the physical, if the NFTs get transferred to someone else, do they have the option to get a physical as well, or they're just kind of one of each out there?
Well, yeah, it's kind of an honor system up to the current collector to
Okay,
negotiate with the next collector how to ship it to them and all that stuff. I definitely am like, you know, letting letting people be responsible with all of that.
totally understandable. And then the last one I want to talk to was back from 2013. Looks like it was an MFA thesis project called, is it Sharon?
Yeah, Charon,
Sharon?
Karen. It's so it's named after the ferryman on the River Styx that would carry, the dead into the afterlife. And the piece is sort of a performance art piece between me and an autonomous drone that me and my colleagues programmed to fly autonomously in this motion capture lab. And it's the logic of it is set up to sort of chase me aggressively and also sort of follow me, and it became this kind of like dance between me and the drone. And as it's flying around, I'm capturing its flight path digitally, like through this three-dimensional volume of space. And as it flies around, it can also sort of like collide with the geometry of its flight path and sort of push it around. So I was thinking about like the physical world and this like virtual representation in the drone's simulation of the physical world, and how our bodies are kind of like crossing this threshold and in this like physical digital relationship. And eventually I took the flight path and um, solidified it and turned it into a 3D printed sculpture. Thinking a lot again about like trying to figure out ways of bridging the physical and the digital. And it's generative, but it's also like tied into the human hand. It's not like fully from the machine. It's like this interplay between humans and technology.
Very cool. That's awesome. And do you still have that piece, or is that something that you've sold at like a exhibit or anything?
I do still have this piece, and like I'm not even sure that I would sell it. Someone would have to give me like a offer I couldn't refuse, because
Yeah.
it's really like it's a sentimental object for me. I spent like I don't even know how long I spent like bringing this object into the world. It's like my baby.
Yeah. And would you ever kind of like go back to some of these projects, these older projects you've worked on in the past, to kind of revisit them and then maybe refine them and do something again? Or are these kind of just projects that you've kind of moved on from and you have like a new focus?
That's a good question. I'm open to anything really, and eventually, later on, I took this sort of logic of this self-consuming flight path and made a another artwork with that algorithm called entropy extropy, which is another sort of drone flight path piece. These are both drone flight paths that were 3D printed, and one of them was electroplated in nickel, I believe,
Oh, wow.
thinking about collapse and growth again of technology and nature. And Neophyte again is a piece that I started 10 years ago in grad school, and I've kind of like rewritten that same piece of software, oh man, a dozen times, 8 times, something like that, just sort of like revisiting, generative plant life and rethinking the software from scratch again in different ways.
Yeah, let's dive into Neophyte. So this was your first drop on Art Blocks back in, was it March of this year? Is that correct?
Mhm.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, I know it was a project based on 10 years of artistic practice. Yeah, did you ever think that this would be something that you would release when you started it 10 years ago, or is it something that you're like, hey, I need to like get this done. This is like a project I'm really happy with.
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I mean, I built it for the Allosphere at UC Santa Barbara, the big virtual reality sphere that I was talking about. And, you know, it's interesting because it's a place where you can relate to a digital object with your whole body. It looms over you and it's massive. And when it's sort of digital on a screen, it's has no scale and it's kind of more of like a sensory memory versus in the Allosphere. It's this big
Hmm.
physical experience. And yeah, I mean, I felt at the time like it wasn't wholly realized. Like, you any simulation of nature is like basically as complicated as you can make it before you give up and move on to the next thing because nature is just so much more complicated than we have time to like really accurately simulate. So yeah, it's something that I've, reimagined a bunch of times actually. I've got some I think documentation on the bottom of this page. So this was kind of like the first view in the Allosphere. If you can see this sort of human, I think that might have been me on the bridge in this surround photograph.
Oh wow.
And I was making like holograms out of the generative plants. I had turned it into a web-based artwork. If you check out a particular nowhere, it's kind of this like self self-guided like infinite desert with these growing plants, and I wrote it in C++, I rewrote it in JavaScript, I rewrote it
Wow.
back into C++.
So it's been, yeah, like kind of a passion project, would you say, like over time?
Totally. Maybe an unhealthy obsession, actually.
Well, we're glad that you're able to launch it on our blocks. And I know that the first five digits represent kind of the each generated plant's like DNA. Like, can you tell us like what does that control and how you came up with that idea?
Yeah, sure. So the way that these plants get generated, it's a recursive kind of system. So at its foundation, I'm using this thing called an L system, but I'm sort of not correctly implementing it. I've sort of like played with that so many times. I have all these like deviations of it, but the core of it is that you start off with, a sequence of patterns like A, B, A, B, A, B, A. And then you have rules like every time you find B, replace it with A, B. And every time you find A, replace it with B. And if you run those rules against one seed over and over again, you get these sort of natural patterns that occur. And it was an algorithm that was developed, I think, to model like bacteria growth, actually. But, with all these natural algorithms, you come up with one thing, and it turns out that like tons of natural systems sort of share the same language. So I'm using the hash of the token sort of to seed each plant's structure and kind of like rhythm as it grows.
Great. And can you talk to us about the color palettes for this specific project? And do you have any favorite color combinations that kind of came through the mentor?
Yeah. So the color palettes, you know, I tend to work very um, emergently where I try not to have like really hard ideas about what I'm gonna make as I'm making it. I try to like, start off with something and just like see what the artwork wants to become. So I generated, tens of thousands of these and was just sort of scrolling through them looking for color combinations that I thought really worked and then broke them down into like 12 possible color combos. And it's really interesting. I minted the first token as a test mint, and it was one of like the rarest traits that came back as totally black and white. And I was like, oh no, people are going to look at this before it gets minted
Yeah.
and think that they're all black and white. Um, but but yeah, it's kind of hard to pick a favorite one. They're all kind of like they're all kind of awesome in their own way to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to talk about so you did offer to some of the collectors a circuit board, which is like a physical piece. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it came about?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, that's Codex 3 here, and I'd made two other codexes before that had these CNC milled frames to them. And, I always wanted to make a circuit board. I think, even as a teenager or a young child, just like taking apart old telephones and stuff, you like see circuit boards and they're just amazingly beautiful,
Mm.
complicated objects. And I love the idea of making circuit boards as well because you have this like sub-millimeter control over exactly how it turns out because fabrication technology is like so dialed in at this point. So, you open up this sort of CAD software for generating circuit boards, and the the traces and like the electrical patterns on here are just totally aesthetic. There's no functioning to them, and every time I get them fabricated, I have to like plead with manufacturer like, don't reject my file, like it's supposed to be like this. Just
Yeah.
like just make it and send it to me. But yeah, people print works on paper from art blocks projects a lot and from generative art projects. But for me, Neophyte really is meant to be viewed over time. The first image is almost like a photograph of um, a point in time, but really, when you watch the piece, it evolves and changes. And some of the longest rhythms in Neophyte take like 4 hours to complete. So I didn't want to like flatten the artwork into like a single, color print of it. So I thought that this would be a nice, like, unique sort of celebration of the project and sort of maybe be the last Neophyte, the famous last words. We'll see if we'll see what happens.
Are they still available then to anyone, or how did you kind of figure out like who this goes to? Because I don't think it's for every piece, correct? Is it?
Yeah, this is just for the first 25 collectors who minted them. And, of course, I've had a handful of people that haven't claimed them. And I've thought about offering them up to later collectors and maybe raffling them off or something like that. If you are watching this and feel very strongly that you want one and you're a current Neophyte holder, definitely reach out to me and we'll see what happens.
Awesome. And was this a kind of a late addition when you were building this project, or is this something, I know it's been like kind of a 10-year process, but did you kind of always figured that you would have this circuit board component?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think when I first started rewriting it for art blocks. It was probably like 6 or 8 months before I finally released it. And I had already made those circuit boards, but through the process of developing Neophyte, I had come up with so many visual representations of what the work could look like. And at some point it was, much more wireframe. And I was just immediately struck by the visual sort of correlation to the circuit boards and sort of decided then that that would be a nice thing to offer.
Cool. And do you mind actually sharing with us some of your personal favorites, or maybe some mints that surprise you?
Yeah, sure. I've got a couple queued up here. Let me just drag them over. So this was the first mint. Like I said, I've still got a hold of it, and very shocked that it turned out to be, I think, maybe one of the only black and white ones in the whole collection. I think the composition is great as the first frame, and just a nice, pleasant surprise. This is token 4, I think, and I really love that it's kind of got this like cherry blossom
Yeah.
vibe to it. It's very like light. Some of them are like really loud and punchy, and I was kind of like debating how natural and sort of like beautiful and soft I wanted them to be versus like embodying and embracing 3D graphics. Like I'm really interested in artwork that like embraces the medium that it is. So like making
Mm.
paintings about painting, like abstract expressionism tries to like, express something unique to painting with a medium of paint. And, I think that like working with, 3D graphics and OpenGL, like you can make things that, embody the fact that it's a rendering. And like this is sort of one of those NFTs where the geometry logic for constructing the plant coherently, I just like intentionally, broke it. You're supposed to be counting by like, every other vertex to like stitch the previous vertexes back together. And like one of the traits, I just like multiply it by 4 or something like that, like a total system shattering thing where all the geometry gets like blown apart and is like no longer trying to sort of like represent the natural world.
That's awesome.
Yeah. One of the last ones I'll show is one of these like spiny growths, and I worked for some time trying to figure out exactly how these would turn out, and they kind of like show up and bloom, and then like fold backwards on themselves and animate over time, and they're kind of depending on the color palette and the thickness of the underlying plant, they kind of like ebb and flow back and forth between feeling very like deserty and cactusy and like very tropical and like palm like.
Yeah, I really love that one a lot. What min number is that?
This is 80.
80. To check that out. I'm curious also to know, when you heard that Neal Stephenson, who's the author who coined the term metaverse, obviously that was something that came up. What was it like in the past week or two? I
Uh-huh.
know he collected some of his first NFTs, and you know, Neophyte was in that list of NFTs. Like, what was your like? How did you hear about? Like, where were you when you kind of like found out that happened?
Yeah, I think I try to hang out in the Art Blocks Discord. I really like the community there. Everyone's like really like friendly and easygoing, and the vibe is good, and people are like sharing artworks and
Mm-hmm.
posting, you know, images of things they had framed, and like it's a really good vibe in the Block Talk Discord.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to see like as sales go by what's going on in the market as well. And I think that I noticed when people collect the work and try to take a peek at their wallet and see like what else they're collecting and what they're into, and just immediately noticed, like Neal Stephenson.eth, like is this the author? What's up with this? So yeah, it was a nice surprise.
That's very cool. And yeah, is there anything else that you want to share from Neophyte?
Hmm. That's a good question. I mean, I would say that, if anyone's interested in the history of it, definitely like check my website out and check the previous projects out and how it's kind of become 3D printed on my sculptures and, existed as web pieces, and definitely check out the mints like live evolving over time, and open up one or two and just like leave it on your computer as you work on something else and watch it change, because it goes through these rhythms where it's like quite predictable for a little while, and then suddenly it like explosively will change and like start making different forms. So spend some time with it.
And I'm curious to know, since obviously this has been a long time in the making for this project. When you have like this piece now that kind of evolves over time, was that the initial intention when you created this project?
Yeah, I definitely wanted it to evolve over time. That was like an initial plan. I can show you some early tests for it. So originally I was thinking, maybe this would start off like in the ocean. Actually, for some reason I was really interested in like waves and focusing more on like a still static, like very isolated kind of form. But with art blocks, it's kind of its own medium. Like I was saying, like if you generated 500 of these, the variation is sort of, it would be really tough to come up with 500 of these that were distinct
Yeah.
enough and interesting enough. So it's kind of like I made this one precious singular generative thing that I really liked, and then I was like, okay, how do I like create a bigger possibility space and like explore explore different ways that this could be represented, and sort of like when you're making generative art as well, you have all these different decisions, and you're like, oh, what if it was like this? What if it was like this? What if it was like this? And in art blocks project, a lot of times those end up becoming traits or parameters that, instead of like abandoning them and moving on, you can kind of like allow each vibe to kind of like stand on its own. But yeah, I had so many different visual, representations of what the project might look like as it was changing over time. I thought, maybe the ocean shouldn't be all over ocean. Maybe it should be like self-contained in these different pieces of geometry. Maybe there should be like a background accumulation happening. Um, I thought, maybe they should be softer and kind of like blurrier and kind of ghosty. Then I was working with like this sort of frame within a frame idea for a little while. But the motion, I think they look really great as still images, but the motion along the border kind of like pulled your eye out of the center of the work and was like sort of ultimately distracting, even though I think that they were making kind of beautiful images. And as well, like, you know, I was pulling out these individual screenshots out of, thousands of generations. Like, oh, like this is a cool vibe. I wonder if I can make the system do this more often. But ultimately, I'm really happy with where it turned out, and think that it was the right call to make. And I've started working on my next Art Blocks project, but um, it's early days, and I'm
Yeah.
I'm curious being too ambitious with it already.
Do you think that's something? I know that Neophyte obviously was kind of a project in the making over a decade, but is that something where you'll kind of take your time and kind of let things evolve over the course of a couple of years, or do you think this is more of a project where you already know kind of the vision and kind of how to look?
Yeah, I have an idea of how it'll turn out, but like I said, it's like pretty ambitious, and I I like kind of going after things that are challenging for me. I think that I could probably like lighten up a little bit, and just try to like bang something out a little quicker and see how it turns out, and not be um so demanding on myself. So yeah, we'll see what happens. It might be something that I start working on for art blocks and then realize that it's, a 2-year engineering project, and decide to do something simpler. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. And actually, one last question for Neophyte: like, how did you know that the project was complete and that you were ready to launch it? Was there like some like kind of a moment, or was this? I feel like that's got to be a challenge for generative artists, because there's so many different outputs, and whatever you do, you can always make it change. But like, yeah, what's kind of your thought process behind that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Through the process, I had developed this script that would, generate 1,000 of them and put them in a big grid. And being able to like sort of step back from the individual changes in code I was making and just see like the entire project as this big population, I felt like really helped me understand like its direction, and whether, you know, um, the code changes I was making was actually like steering the entire system in the right direction. And it's definitely a different way of thinking about generative art um, than individual images, like thinking of it as a whole population. So, watching that population evolve, I think, was like the key to deciding it was done.
Great. And all right, now moving on, I'm curious to know, when you're not in Block Talk and talking on the community, like what do you do in your spare time when you aren't coding for a project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I kind of work like a maniac. I probably spend like 70 or 80 hours a week between my job and writing code and making art and uh, doing these kinds of things. So I should probably lighten up a little bit, but I like skateboarding a lot. I used to be really into doing downhill skateboarding down mountain roads and stuff with like the full leathers and full face helmet, like going 40 miles an hour on open roads with traffic. But as I've gotten older, I've mellowed out a little bit. So, I just push around the neighborhood and stuff, and um, try to go surfing every once in a while, and I really love like, taking walks in nature. So I try to take a walk at least once a day, and definitely on the weekend, like get out somewhere remote and like go go hiking in California and check out the redwoods and stuff like that.
Awesome. And are there, because obviously a lot of your projects are, you know, revolve around the theme of plants. Like, do you have like a go-to place where you're like you go for inspiration, or is it kind of just like anywhere that you're just at and you kind of just go with it?
Yeah, I kind of just go with it. I really love like finding new places, and just checking stuff out. There's kind of like a funny life hack on Google Maps. If you type in scenic spot or something like that, it pulls up all of these like cool places you wouldn't find otherwise. Like if you're just searching for like a beach, or like show me where the nearest state park is or something like that. Like Google has this whole other like categorization where you end up in these like crazy little like beach coves with like a cave or something like that that you wouldn't have found otherwise.
Awesome. And how do you prepare for coding for a project? Like when you're, I mean, it sounds like you're constantly, working and coding projects, but I mean, do you have kind of like this mindset you get yourself into, or do you have, like I know you said that you go out in nature for like some kind of inspiration, but like when you're like at your computer, do you have like music in the background to kind of like get you in the zone, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I try to draw ideas and stuff on paper, but definitely like listening to like house music and techno and stuff like that. I can't really listen to anything with lyrics. Um, and yeah, I mean, a lot of the times I'll just like write out the program in comments, like in plain English. Like, first, I'm going to, figure out how many of these things there needs to be, and then I need to sort them, and I need to do this other thing, and then, just trying to, uh, trying to communicate that in code instead of like the written word.
Awesome. And yeah, do you have any other plans for the rest of the year? I know you mentioned, you're working on an art blocks project, and obviously that'll kind of be um, a big undertaking. It'll kind of take a little bit of time. But yeah, do you have any other projects or plans for any of the releases, whether it be on other platforms?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's, like I said, I've got an upcoming, well, I wouldn't say it's upcoming, but I'm starting to work on my next art blocks release. Um, and the Neophyte circuit boards are going to be in an exhibit coming up, um, called Planet B, Radicants, which was curated by Nicolas Baudrillard, who's sort of like a famous curator for coining the term relational aesthetics. So I'm really, proud to be in that show, and proud to show off the Neophyte circuit board in that kind of contemporary art context. But yeah, besides that, really just sort of like watching my curiosity lead to different places. I started a project called notaudited.xyz, where I'm publishing like really sort of experimental smart contracts and just putting stuff out there. Like maybe it doesn't fit into my contemporary art practice or my traditional, like the type of work I show in my portfolio, but I have like a funny idea and I just like bang out a smart contract in a weekend, and like it's free. It's a free NFT. I don't know if it's gonna like break. I don't know if the contract's going to break or whatever. I'm not trying to like drain anybody's wallets or anything like that. But like as an example, I did a project called Lockout, where when you mint the NFT, um, you have to pick a date in the future, and the NFT is like fully on chain and generative, and it's like an image of the date in you know 60 days from now. And then once that 60 days comes up, you can't move the NFT anymore. It gets like locked to your wallet, or it gets locked to whatever contract you transferred it to. And like interestingly, Vitalik has been writing about like soul bound NFTs and like NFTs that never can be transferred. Like maybe you've got like a diploma from a university that you wouldn't want to transfer, or something like that. And I hadn't read his essay before I built that project, but one of those weird things where like it's an experimental kind of conceptual artwork on the blockchain.
Definitely. And I think that's kind of the beauty about this space is that everyone is able to kind of dabble, try different things and experiment. And I mean, who knows? I think that's what is so great about, Web3. And yeah, I look forward to seeing more projects and things that you come up with in the future. As far as resources, for people that are aspiring, maybe generative artists, do you have any resources, whether it be like websites, books, essays, that you would recommend to an aspiring artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the loudest number one thing is checking out Daniel Schiffman on YouTube. He has this YouTube channel called The Coding Train, as well as like a book called what's his book called? The Nature of Code, I think is what it's called. And
I
he
think that's
goes
right.
through, yeah, he goes through sort of like algorithm development, but also conceptually thinking about object-oriented programming, but also like nature simulations. And he's got, like I said, these YouTube videos where he's like super friendly and like, showing you what's up. Besides that, there's a good book called it's called The New Media Reader, um, by the MIT Press, printed by the MIT Press, and it's like an amazing history of the documentation of new media art and its foundations and where it came from and how it's evolved over time. So yeah, I think the New Media Reader is like a kind of fundamental thing that if you want to know the history of media arts, you should pick up.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, we'll definitely get those links into the info part of the YouTube page for people. One of the last things I want to ask is, mental health is such an important part in this space. Like how do you wind down after you completed Neophyte? Being that especially that was a long and yeah, just a project that took a considerable amount of time. Like how do you kind of wind down after accomplishing and finishing up something so big?
Totally. That was insane. That was so much work, and also just the pressure. I was like, the first one's got to be, it's got to be this certain thing, and like, you know, holding myself to too high of standards. But yeah, like I said, going in walks in nature. I like to try to sit outside first thing in the morning and like have a cup of coffee and a croissant and just like, enjoy the morning before anything else happens. And also like giving yourself some time to just like do nothing. Like I think that I bought Elden Ring and like a PlayStation 5 after Neophyte came out and just became like a couch potato, like slaying, ogres and stuff for a little while. Cause you know, I don't often play video games, but like when I finish a big project, like I remember I made this VR painting app, and when I finally launched it, I bought myself like a Nintendo Switch and was like of I think like a 50-inch TV and a Nintendo Switch just to play The Legend of Zelda, and like didn't do much else after I launched that app. So yeah, give yourself the permission to veg out and like disconnect from whatever you've been focusing on.
I love that. I appreciate you sharing that. How can people reach you? Should they have any questions? And also, can you mention your website to people?
Yeah, it's just my full name. It's just sterlingcrispin.com. I'm the same on Twitter and Instagram, although I don't post to Instagram super often. I'd say, hit me up on Twitter. My DMs are open. I try to be fairly responsive as long as you're not like, we need you to promote like Slappy Seals or something like that. Yeah, hit me up.
I love it. Well, Sterling, thank you so much for being on After Dinner Mints. It's so great to kind of hear about the pieces you've made, prior to Neophyte, and then also just talking about that project and what you'll be creating in the future. I really appreciate you being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Super appreciate it. And yeah, see you on Block Talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we got a couple of news and notes. On May the 26th. Actually, on June the 1st, I apologize. We have generative artist Steve Piccolini, that's creator of the Crypto God King, I Saw It in a Dream, and Fake Internet Money. So definitely looking forward to talking to Steve. We have a Twitter Spaces discussion called Minters and Makers. It's a weekly show with 3 to 5 artists, collectors, or other notable people in the community with conversations surrounding art. Our next show is on the 26th. May 26th, that's Thursday, starting at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern, featuring Alexi Andre, Peter Pasma, Stefano Contiero, and Siberia. That'll be a great conversation. Those will be recorded, and you can also tune into those conversations live if you want on the Artblocks Twitter handle, which is at artblocks_IO. Those discussions will be recorded, as I mentioned, and be turned into podcast format. This will be available on Apple, Spotify, Google, all those great platforms. Also, speaking of podcasts, all of these After Dinnerman's conversations, the audio will be turned into a podcast as well. So for those people who want to hear any conversations on the road, you can do that at your own time on Apple, Spotify, and Google as well. Finally, we have a weekly newsletter that gets delivered once a week with information on upcoming drops and generative art related news. You can find a link to the newsletter in the description of this YouTube video. Sterling, again, thank you so much for joining me on After Dinner Mints. Really appreciate you and look forward to seeing you again more often in the community. Comment, like, and subscribe to the Artblocks YouTube channel. Be kind to each other, buy what you love, and we will see you all next week. Thanks, Sterling. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.